Good afternoon. Today's lecture is about different languages spoken in the United States. The Modern Language Association has put together data on the numbers of speakers and the locations of the 30 most commonly spoken languages in the United States. Let me first explain how the information was gathered. The data came from US Census information. In addition to the usual census question about number of family members and age, people were asked about language. If a language other than English was spoken at home, if the answer was yes, then the person was asked to name the language. You might be surprised at how many different languages were reported. 300. Yes, 300 different languages are spoken in the United States. The Modern Language Association focuses on the 30 most common languages. Of course, English is the number one language. Spanish is the second most common. Chinese is the third, and French is the fourth. Now, the Modern Language Association has put all this information together in different ways. So, for example, you can look up a particular language, let's say Korean, and see how many speakers there are throughout the United States. There are almost 900,000 Korean speakers in the United States. Then you can see how they compare to the total number of speakers of languages other than English. So people who speak another language, 2% are Korean speakers. It's also possible to see how many Korean speakers there are in different areas. Two main areas of concentration are Southern California and Washington State. Now, another way you can look at the information is by starting with place the entire United States, a state, a country, or a city. So, for example, look at the state of Texas. In Texas, English is spoken. Okay, so there are different ways to look at this data. Let's talk about possible way this information could be used or why it's important. I'd like to open this up for discussion. Do you have any ideas? Yes, in the front row. I think this could be important for education purposes, so people know what kinds of classes might be needed in the school or things like that. And I think it's also important to understand the cultural makeup of the United States. Yes, definitely. And anyone else? Yes. Isn't it also important to be aware of possible language change? If one language is used less or more than over time. Yes, absolutely. Okay. We're out of time, but we'll talk about language change next week, so we'll discuss more about that. At home, by just over 68% of the people who speak another language, 86% speak Spanish, and it's only 1 or 2% for any other languages. So Spanish really is a predominant language other than English in Texas. Now you can then compare the information or state, for example, look at the state of New York. In New York, a little over 72% of people speak English at home. Of the speaker of other languages, 49% speak Spanish, and then 8% speak Chinese, 6% speak Italian, and 4% speak Russian, and 4% speak French. So you can see that there are a lot of Spanish speakers in New York, but there are also other languages spoken, more than so in Texas. Our presentation today is on language change and language loss in the world. First, we'll talk about what the situation is, and then we'll give some example of the programs being implemented. Alan, do you want to begin? Okay, for some background on the situation. Okay, first. Okay, for some background on the situation, there are actually different views on how many languages exist in the world today. Most estimates say that there are somewhere between 6,000 and 6,800 languages still in use. Unfortunately, many of these languages are in danger of disappearing, of becoming extinct. Now, it's hard to find an exact estimate on how many, but some people believe that as many as half of the languages still in use could be lost by the end of the century. Think of it, half of the languages that exist. Here's the most specific example of how languages are being lost. An article in the magazine Nature in 2003 stated that there are 46 different people around the world who are the last remaining speaker of their languages. Wow, imagine if you only speaker of the language left. Yes, now one of the problems with all this is that it's very difficult to get complete agreement on actual language members, and then it's also hard to find agreement on a number of languages that are at risk disappearing. One of the big reasons for this is that criteria used are very often very different. Let's look at an example. For instance, some researchers might consider a language in danger if there are less than 10,000 speakers of it left, while other researchers might not consider a language in danger until there are only 500 speakers left. The point is that different researchers have different ideas about when they might say that a language is really in danger of disappearing. So it's a problem. But for the most part, they all agree that languages are in fact disappearing. So yes, that's true, and most agree that's happening quite quickly. So then the question is why it is important? That we don't actually know what information, tradition, or things like that we're losing when a language disappear. So that situation. In terms of language law, the good news is that there are some action that appear to help, and there are also examples of languages that are in better state than they are. For example, Welsh, the language spoken in Wales. There are fewer and fewer speakers of Welsh, and well, more people started speaking English inclusively. But the country started working very hard to increase the number of speakers of Welsh, teaching and using Welsh in school and encourage the use of Welsh in public forums. And there has been some progress. Native American language in North America are not example. There was one more than 250 languages spoken by Native Americans. Unfortunately, experts now estimate there are only about 150 languages still in use. And even more unfortunate, experts think that very few of these are likely to exist in 60 years. But there are some interesting programs being used to try to keep them alive. How can you give a yes? It's a little sad, but obviously, having all that information recognized gives some possibility that they can still work on languages even after remaining. Another way to use the language knowledge that the elder have is by having the older people work with their children. The babysit or help with preschool. They're doing this and the Russian language in the Southwest. It's interesting because in some places distance is a real problem. Like in Alaska, yeah, Alaska is a good example. People might not be able to get together to speak because of distance, so they teach and learn over the phone. So as Ellen mentioned, with some of the Native American language, there are actually no longer any living speakers. So there are also some examples why people are trying to learn the language of their ancestors by learning old records. Obviously, this would be a very difficult progress. Yes, and it's also important to say these kind of programs are difficult and slow. In the end, they may not be enough. Yeah, true. Any questions?